89. The Revolution of 1917. End of the Tsardom. The Revolution of March 1917. War again put the Tsarist regime to a test that it could not meet. In the new kind of total war after 1914, willing cooperation between government and people was indispensable to success. This essential prerequisite the Tsarist Empire did not have. National minorities, Poles, Ukrainians, the peoples of the Caucasus, Jews, and others, were disaffected. As for the socialists, who in every other European parliament voted for funds to finance the war, the dozen otherwise disunited socialists in the Duma 1341 refused to do so and were promptly jailed. Ordinary workers and peasants marched off with the army, but without the sense of personal conviction felt in 1914 by common people in other European nations. More decisive was the attitude of the middle class. Because they patriotically wished Russia to win, the glaring mismanagement of the government was the more intolerable to them. The Russian disasters at the battles of Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, with which the war opened in 1914, were followed by the advance of the Central Powers into Russia in 1915, at the cost of 2 million Russian soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. At the war's outbreak, middle-class people, as in all countries, offered their assistance to the government. The provincial zemstvos joined together to form a union of zemstvos and to mobilize agriculture for the war effort, and business groups at Petrograd, as St. Petersburg was renamed during the war, formed a commercial and industrial committee to get the factories into maximum production. The government distrusted these signs of public activity arising outside official circles. On the other hand, organized in this way, middle-class people became conscious of their own strength and more critical of the bureaucracy. Rumors spread that some officials in the war ministry itself were pro-German, reactionaries who feared the liberalism of Britain and France with which Russia was allied. Middle-class support. Life at court was increasingly bizarre. The Tsarina Alexandra, German by origin, looked upon all Russians outside her own circle with contempt, incited her husband to play the proud and pitiless autocrat, and took advice from a self-appointed holy man, the mysterious Rasputin. She was convinced that Rasputin possessed supernatural powers because he had apparently cured her young son of hemophilia. Rasputin, by his influence over her, had a voice in appointments to high office. All who wished an audience with the imperial pair had to go through him. Patriotic and enlightened persons of all classes vainly protested. In these circumstances, and given the military defeats, the members of the 1342 Zemstvos and other such wartime bodies increasingly complained about fundamental conditions in the state, as well as governmental incompetence. The government responded by holding them at arm's length. The Tsarist regime, caught in a total war, was afraid of the help offered by its own people. During the war, in September 1915, the Duma was suspended. The war thus revived all the basic political issues that had been latent since the Revolution of 1905. The Union of Zemstvos demanded restoration of the Duma, which reassembled in November 1916 and expressed loud indignation at the way affairs were conducted. In December, Rasputin was assassinated by nobles at the court. The Tsar began to consider repression and again adjourned the Duma. Members of the Duma and of the new extra-governmental bodies concluded that the 762 situation could be saved only by force. It is when moderate persons, normally concerned with their own business, come to such conclusions that revolution becomes a political possibility. The shift of moderates and liberals, their need of a coup d'état to save themselves from reactionaries, likewise raised the long-awaited prospects of the most militant professional revolutionaries. Deepening of political divisions. 1343, Tsar Nicholas II, the last of the Romanov rulers in Russia, sought to wage war against Germany without mobilizing the popular support of the Russian people. This photograph shows the Tsar with his wife and children at the beginning of the war. Nicholas abdicated the throne in March 1917, and the Bolsheviks put the entire family to death in the following year. Popper photo, Getty Images. The mystical monk Rasputin gained a much resented influence over Tsarina Alexandra and the affairs of the Russian government because he seemed to cure the illness of the royal family's young son. Rasputin's mysterious personality is evoked in this picture. which was taken shortly before his enemies at court murdered him in 1916. DEA Orty, Getty Images. 763-144 again, it was the workers of Petrograd who precipitated the crisis. Food had become scarce, as in all the belligerent countries. But the Tsarist administration was too clumsy and too demoralized by graft to institute the controls that had become usual elsewhere, such as maximum prices and ration cards. It was the poorest who felt the food shortage most keenly. On March 8, 1917, food riots broke out, which soon developed, doubtless with the help of revolutionary intellectuals, into political insurrection. Crowds shouted, "Down with the Tsar!" Troops within the city refused to fire on the insurgents. Mutiny and insubordination spread from unit to unit. Within a few days, a Soviet of workers' and soldiers' deputies, on the model of 1905, had been organized in Petrograd. Middle-class leaders demanded the formation of a new ministry commanding the confidence of a majority of the Duma. The Tsar retaliated by again disbanding the Duma. The Duma set up an executive committee to take charge until the situation clarified. There were now two new authorities in the city. One, the Duma Committee, essentially moderate, constitutionalist, and relatively legal. The other, the Petrograd Soviet, representing revolutionary forces arising by spontaneous upsurge from below. The Petrograd Soviet, or Workers' Council, was to play in 1917 a role like that of the Paris Commune of 1792, constantly pushing the supposedly higher and more nationwide authority to the left. The Soviet became the public auditorium and administrative center of the working-class upheaval. Because it was generally socialist in its outlook, all the factions of doctrinaire socialists, social revolutionaries, Mensheviks, Bolsheviks, tried to win it over and utilize it for their own ends. The Petrograd Soviet, the Duma Committee, under pressure from the Petrograd Soviet, on March 14th set up a provisional government under Prince Lvov. The Duma liberals, as a concession to the Soviet, admitted one socialist to the new government, Alexander Kerensky, a moderate, legal-minded social revolutionary, and they furthermore consented to demand the abdication 1345 of Nicholas II. The Tsar was then at the front. He tried to return to his palace near Petrograd, but the imperial train was stopped and turned back by troops. The army, fatefully, was taking the side of the revolution. The very generals in the field, unable to vouch for the loyalty of their men, advised abdication. Nicholas yielded. His brother, the Grand Duke, declined to succeed him. And on March 17, 1917, Russia became a republic. The Bolshevik Revolution, November 1917. The provisional government, following the best precedents of European revolutions, called for elections by universal male suffrage to a constituent assembly, which was to meet late in the year and prepare a constitution for the new regime. It tried also to continue the war against Germany. In July, an offensive was mounted, but the demoralized Russian armies were quickly routed. Pending final decision by the Constituent Assembly, the provisional government promised wholesale redistribution of land to the peasants, but took no action. Meanwhile, the peasants, driven by the old land hunger, were already overrunning the rural left districts, burning and looting. At the front, the armies melted away. Many high officers refused to serve the Republic, and masses of peasant soldiers simply turned their backs and went home, unwilling to be absent while land was being handed out. The Petrograd Soviet, opposing the provisional government, called for speedy termination of the war. Fearing reactionary officers, it issued on March 14 its Order No. 1, entrusting command within the army to committees elected by both officers and soldiers. Discipline collapsed. The revolution was thus already well advanced when Lenin and the other Bolsheviks arrived in Petrograd in the middle of April. They immediately took sides with the Petrograd Soviet against the provisional 764 government, and with similar Soviets that had sprung up in other parts of the country. In July, an armed uprising of soldiers and sailors, which the Bolshevik Central Committee disapproved of as premature, was put down. The Bolsheviks were blamed, and Lenin had to flee to Finland. But as a 1346 bid for popular support, the provisional government named the socialist Alexander Kerensky as its head in place of Prince Lvov in an uneasy coalition of moderate socialists and liberals. Kerensky's middle position was next threatened from the right. The newly appointed military commander, General Kornilov, dispatched a force of cavalry to restore order. Not only conservatives but liberals wished him success in the hope that he would suppress the Soviets. Kornilov's movement was defeated, but with the aid of the Bolsheviks, who rallied with other socialists, and of revolutionary-minded soldiers in the city who offered armed resistance. Radicals denounced liberals as accomplices in Kornilov's attempt at counter-revolution, and both camps blamed Kerensky for having allowed the plot to be hatched under his government. Both liberals and moderate socialists abandoned Kerensky, and he had to form a government of uncertain political support. Meanwhile, the food shortage worsened, with transport disarranged and the farm population in turmoil, so that workers in the city listened more willingly to the most extreme speakers. Revolution, advancing Russia's costly military defeats and the food shortages that developed because of the long war, contributed decisively to the revolutionary uprising that overthrew Tsar Nicholas II. Similar discontents soon undermined popular support for the 1347 provisional government, which tried to continue the war. These women in Petrograd were demanding increased food rations for Russian soldiers, but their demonstration in 1917 is an example of the wider political mobilization that swept across Russia during that revolutionary year. Savphoto/Getty Images. The Bolsheviks adapted their program to what the most active elements in a revolutionary people seemed to want. Lenin concentrated on 4 points. First, immediate peace 765 with the Central Powers. Second, redistribution of land to the peasants. Third, transfer of factories, mines, and other industrial plants from the capitalists to committees of workers in each plant. And fourth, recognition of the Soviets as the supreme power instead of the provisional government. Lenin, though a rigid dogmatist on abstract questions, was a flexible and bold tactician, and his program in 1917 was dictated more by the immediate situation in Russia than by considerations of theoretical Marxism. What was needed was to win over soldiers, peasants, and workers by promising them peace, land, and bread. With this program, and by infiltration and parliamentary stratagems, as well as by their accuracy as political prophets, predicting the Kornilov counter-revolution and unmasking the trend of middle-way liberals to support it, the Bolsheviks won a majority in the Petrograd Soviet and in Soviets all over the country. Lenin thereupon raised the cry, "All power to the Soviets!" to crush Kerensky and forestall the coming Constituent Assembly. And he decided that the hour had come for the seizure of power. The Bolsheviks themselves were divided, but Lenin was backed by Trotsky, Stalin, and a majority of the party's Central Committee. Troops garrisoned in Petrograd voted to support the Soviets, which the Bolsheviks now controlled. On the night of November 6 to 7, 1917, the Bolsheviks took over telephone exchanges, railway stations, and electric power plants in the city. A warship turned its guns on the Winter Palace, where Kerensky's government sat. The latter could find almost no one to defend it. The hastily assembled Congress of Soviets pronounced the provisional government defunct and named in its place a Council of People's 1348 commissars, of which Lenin became the head. Trotsky was named Commissar for Foreign Affairs. Stalin, Commissar for Nationalities. Kerensky fled, eventually arriving in the United States, where he died in 1970. All power to the Soviets! At the Congress of Soviets, Lenin introduced 2 resolutions. One called upon the belligerent governments to negotiate a just democratic peace, without annexations and without indemnities. The second abolished all landlord property, immediately and without compensation. Although determined to establish a proletarian dictatorship, the Bolsheviks knew the importance of the Russian peasants. The millions of acres belonging to the large estates that were now expropriated provided a base of peasant support for the new regime, without which it could hardly have survived. Resolutions on peace and property. Thus was accomplished the Bolshevik or November Revolution I. But the long-awaited Constituent Assembly remained to be dealt with. It finally met in January 1918. 36 million persons had voted for it. Of these, 9 million had voted for Bolshevik deputies, showing that the Bolshevik program, launched less than a year before by a small band of émigrés, had a widespread mass appeal. But almost 21 million had voted for Kerensky's party, the agrarian, populist, peasant-oriented social revolutionaries. However, said Lenin, to hand over power to the Constituent Assembly would again be compromising with the malignant bourgeoisie. The assembly was broken up on the second day of its sessions. Armed sailors dispatched by the People's Commissars simply surrounded it. The forcible dissolution of the Constituent Assembly was a frank repudiation of majority rule in favor of class rule, to be exercised 1349 for the proletariat by the Bolsheviks. The dictatorship of the proletariat was now established. 2 months later, in March 1918, the Bolsheviks renamed themselves the Communist Party. 766 historical documents. John Reed, 10 Days That Shook the World, 1919. Government leaders in Western Europe and America condemned the Bolsheviks' Marxist ideology and supported the anti-Bolshevik forces that opposed Russia's revolutionary regime after 1917. But some outsiders endorsed the revolution's ideas and goals. One such foreign sympathizer was the American journalist John Reed, 1887 to 1920, who was in Petrograd during the revolution, and who immediately wrote a controversial book to explain why the Bolsheviks had taken power. Although he did not foresee the Soviet regime's brutal violence or far-reaching repression, he was one of the first writers to argue that the Russian Revolution would have global historical significance. Instead of being a destructive force, it seems to me that the Bolsheviks were the only party in Russia with a constructive program and the power to impose it on the country. If they had not succeeded to the government when they did, there is little doubt in my mind that the armies of Imperial Germany would have been in Petrograd and Moscow in December, and Russia would again be ridden by a czar. It is still fashionable, after a whole year of the Soviet government, to speak of the Bolshevik insurrection as an adventure. Adventure it was, and one of the most marvelous mankind ever embarked upon, sweeping into history at the head of the toiling masses and staking everything on their vast and simple desires. Already, the machinery had been set up by which the land of the great estates could be distributed among the peasants. No matter what one thinks of Bolshevism, it is undeniable that the Russian Revolution is one of the great events of human history, and the rise of the Bolsheviks a phenomenon of worldwide importance. Just as 1350 historians search the records for the minutest details of the story of the Paris Commune, so they will want to know what happened in Petrograd in November 1917. John Reed, 10 Days That Shook the World, New York, Boney and Liverite, 1919, pp. ZC. The New Regime, The Civil War, 1918 to 1922. In these same months, the Communists, or Bolsheviks, signed the Peace of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, surrendering to Germany control over the Baltic provinces, Poland, and Ukraine. The Russian conquests of 2 centuries were thus abandoned, but to Lenin it made no difference. He was convinced that the events that he had just mastered in Russia were the prelude to a general upheaval, that the war, still raging in Europe, would bring all of the belligerent nations to the inevitable proletarian or Marxist revolution. Imperial Germany would therefore give way to a new socialist state, and borders would change again. In any case, it was largely by promising peace that Lenin had won enough backing to overthrow Kerensky, who on this deep popular demand had delayed too long, waiting for Britain and France to release Russia from its treaty obligations as an ally. But real peace did not come, for the country sank immediately into civil war. Not only old Tsarist reactionaries, and not only bourgeois liberals, Zemstvo members, and constitutional Democrats, but all types of anti-Leninist socialists as well, Mensheviks and social revolutionaries, scattered in all directions to organize resistance against the regime of Soviets and People's Commissars, and they soon obtained aid from the Western Allies. Both sides competed for the support of the peasants. 767. As for the new regime, the oldest of its institutions was the Bolshevik Party, founded as a wing of the Social Democrats in 1903. The next oldest were the Soviets, dating from 1905 and 1917, and then came the Council of People's Commissars set up on the day of the coup d'etat. The first institution founded under the new order was a political police, An extraordinary all-Russian commission of struggle against 1351 counter-revolution, speculation, and sabotage, commonly known from its Russian initials as the Cheka, and in later years, without basic change of methods or purpose, under such successive names as the OGPU, the NKVD, the MVD, and the KGB. It was established on December 7, 1917. In January 1918, the Red Army was founded, with Leon Trotsky as war commissar and virtually its creator. In July, a constitution was promulgated. In social policy, the Bolsheviks at first adopted no long-range plans, contenting themselves with a mixture of principle and expediency known as war communism. They nationalized some of the largest industrial enterprises, but left the bulk under the control of workers' committees. The pressing problem was to find food, which had ceased to move through any normal channels. The peasants, very much as in the French Revolution under similar conditions, worthless money, insecure property titles, unruly hired hands, armed marauding, and a doubtful future, were producing less food than usual, consuming it themselves, or hoarding it on their own farms. The response of the government and city workers also resembled the French response in 1793. The new government levied requisitions, required the peasants to make stated deliveries, and invited labor unions to send armed detachments into the country to procure food by force. Class war broke out between the larger landowning farmers who feared that their very subsistence as well as their property would be taken away, and city people, often supported by hungry agricultural laborers who were driven to desperation by famine. Many peasants, especially the larger farmers, therefore rallied to anti-Bolshevik political leaders. Centers of resistance developed on every side. In the Don Valley, a small force assembled under Generals Kornilov and Denikin, with many army officers, gentry landowners, and expropriated business people taking part in it. The social revolutionaries gathered followers on the Middle Volga. Their most significant military support came from a force of some 45,000 Czechs, who had deserted or been captured from the Austro-Hungarian armies and had then been organized as a Czech legion to fight on the side of Russia and the Allies. After the November Revolution and the Peace of Brest-Litovsk, these Czechs decided to leave Russia by 1352 way of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, return to Europe by sea, and resume fighting on the Western Front. When Bolshevik officials undertook to disarm them, they allied with the social revolutionaries on the Volga. The Allied governments believed that Bolshevism was a temporary madness that with little effort could be stopped. They wished above all to bring Russia back into the war against Germany, an objective they sought to achieve by launching a military intervention in East Asia through Vladivostok. The Japanese, who had declined military aid to their allies in any other theater, viewed this action favorably, seeing in the ruin of the Russian Empire a rare opportunity to develop their sphere of influence in East Asia. It was agreed that an inter-allied military force should land at Vladivostok, cross Siberia, join with the Czechs, break up Bolshevism, and fall upon the Germans in Eastern Europe. For this ambitious scheme, Britain and France could supply no soldiers, engaged as they were on the Western Front. The force turned out to be American and Japanese, but predominantly Japanese. Japan contributed 72,000 men, and the United States only 8,000. They landed at Vladivostok in August 1918. The Civil War lasted until 1920, or even later in some places. It became a confused melee in which the Bolsheviks struggled against Russian opponents, independence-minded 768 nationalities, and foreign intervention. But the anti-Bolshevik forces could never unite. The anti-communist Russians represented every hue of the political spectrum, from unregenerate czarists to left-wing social revolutionaries. Many of the rightist anti-Bolsheviks openly antagonized the peasants by proceeding to restore expropriated landed estates in areas they occupied. Many engaged in vindictive reprisals in a kind of white terror. Leon Trotsky, on the other hand, shaped in the Civil Wars a disciplined, effective Red Army, recruiting it, organizing it, unifying it, and equipping it as best he could, assigning political commissars to watch it, and assuring that trustworthy officers occupied its high command. The Bolsheviks could denounce the foreign intervention and appeal to national patriotism, and they could win peasant support by the distribution of land. the 1353 disunity among anti-Bolshevik forces. Leon Trotsky commanded the Red Army that defeated the Bolsheviks, many enemies in the Civil War of 1918 to 1922. He is seen here in the early years of the revolution, when he emerged as a key political and military leader of the Bolshevik Party and an influential theorist of international communism. Holton Archive, Getty Images. By 1922, the Bolsheviks, or communists, had established themselves up to the frontiers of the former Tsarist Empire in every direction, except on the European side. There, the Band of Baltic states, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, remained independent. Poland, as a result of its own war against the Bolsheviks in 1920, retained a frontier farther east than the Allies themselves had intended. Russia thus lost thousands of square miles of territory and buffer areas that the Tsars had brought into their empire over the centuries. These territories remained lost to the new Soviet state until the Second World War. But peace was won and the regime stood. It was during these civil wars that the Red Terror broke out in Russia. Like the famous terror in France in 1793, it was in part a response to civil and foreign war. The Bolshevik terror, however, went far beyond the 13-5-5-7-6-9 violence of the earlier Jacobin terror. Thousands were shot in Russia merely as hostages, a practice unknown to Europe for some time. And other thousands were killed without even the summary formalities of revolutionary tribunals. The Cheka was the most formidable political police that had yet appeared. The Bolshevik terror was aimed at the physical extermination of all who opposed the new regime. A bourgeois class background alone would go far to confirm the guilt of any person charged with conspiring against the Soviet state. The Bolsheviks' consolidation of power depended on the carefully controlled Red Army. These men were drafted into the army of peasants and workers that defeated anti-Bolshevik forces throughout Russia in the early 1920s. Slava Katamidze collection, Getty Images. But a working-class background for a man or a woman made little difference. In 1918, a young woman named Fanny Kaplan shot at Lenin and wounded him. She deposed that she had favored the Constituent Assembly, that her parents had emigrated to America in 1911, that she 1355 had 6 working-class brothers and sisters, and she admitted that she had intended to kill Lenin. She was, of course, executed, as were others in Petrograd. When the sailors at Kronstadt, who were among the first adherents of the Bolsheviks, rose in 1921, objecting to domination of the Soviets by the party, threatening a kind of leftist renewal of the revolution, like the Hebertists who had opposed Robespierre, they were branded as petty bourgeois and shot down by the thousands. The terror struck at the revolutionists themselves quite as much as it did the bourgeoisie. It was to continue to do so long after the revolution was secure. 770. The terror succeeded in its purpose. Together with the victories of the Red Army, it established the new regime. Those bourgeois who survived took on the protective coloration of toilers. No bourgeois person as such presumed to take part in the new politics of Russia. Mensheviks and other socialists fleeing to Europe told appalling stories of the human toll taken by Lenin. Horrified European socialists repudiated communism as an atrocious Russian perversion of Marxism. But at whatever cost, Lenin and his followers were now able to start building the socialist society as they understood it.